You embarrass me. I'm disgusted by you. My daughter-in-law's words cut sharply through the quiet hum of the graduation dinner. The room, filled with soft laughter and clinking glasses, suddenly felt colder. I smiled calmly. I had been waiting for this moment. I signaled discreetly to a waiter nearby. Moments later, a video began to play on the large TV mounted on the far wall of the Riverside Country Club dining room. The screen flickered, capturing the attention of every guest. And a voice spoke softly. I make the shrew faint when I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end, and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has traveled. At 67, I believed I had seen every shade of human cruelty. Twice married, a widow once, and the mother of 3 children. Raised mostly on my own, I thought I was prepared for anything. I was wrong. The dining room buzzed with restrained excitement typical of graduation celebrations. Crystal glasses tinkled softly against fine china, and murmurs of congratulations floated through the elegant room. My grandson Elliot, no longer in cap and gown but a sharp navy suit, sat at the head of our table. His grin was radiant, filled with the pride of a young man who had just conquered the world. A full scholarship to Harvard Law School. My chest swelled with a pride so fierce I feared it might burst. Grandma Thelma, Elliot whispered, leaning toward me with bright eyes. Did you see Professor Morrison's face during my speech? I think I actually made him tear up. I reached out and squeezed his rough, calloused hand. The hands he earned working summer construction jobs to help pay his way. You've always had a gift with words, sweetheart. Your grandfather would have been so proud. Then the atmosphere shifted abruptly. Oh, please. The sharp voice sliced through our bubble like a knife through silk. All heads turned toward Esm, my daughter-in-law. She sat rigid, her polished smile thin and sharp-faced, one she reserved for moments when she meant to wound. Her perfectly manicured fingers gripped her wine glass so tightly I feared it might shatter. Esme, my son David warned quietly that she had already crossed the line. Slowly rising, she let the light catch her designer dress as she turned to face me. Nearby tables hushed as familiar faces from our social circle turned toward our little drama. You want to know what I really think about this whole charade? Her voice carried just enough for others to hear. This woman, she said, pointing at me, has been playing the devoted grandmother for years, but the truth is, she's nothing but an embarrassment. My stomach twisted, but my face remained carefully neutral. I had long ago learned not to give Esm the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. Mom, stop. David's voice held a note of desperation I'd heard too many times before. But Esme wasn't finished. Taking a step closer to my chair, her voice rose with venom. You want to know what your precious grandmother really is, Elliot? She's a fraud. A pathetic old woman who can't even dress appropriately for her own grandson's graduation. Dinner. I glanced down at my navy dress, conservative, well-tailored, and entirely suitable for the occasion. But I knew this wasn't about my clothes. You embarrass me. Esme spat, her words echoing across half the dining room. Every single time we're in public together, I have to pretend you're not a complete social disaster. You say the wrong things. You dress like you shop at thrift stores. You have no idea how to behave around people who matter. The room fell into a heavy silence. I felt dozens of eyes locked on our table, and I could almost hear the whispers that would dominate the country club gossip for weeks. Elliot's face had turned pale. Esme, that's enough, David said firmly. No, it's not, she shot back, turning to me with pure contempt blazing in her eyes. I have carried the embarrassment of being associated with you for 15 years. 15 years of making excuses, of trying to minimize the damage you caused just by existing in our lives. She leaned in, lowering her voice to a whisper so harsh it felt more like a threat. You disgust me, Thelma. I look at you and feel sick that you're supposed to be family. The words hit me like physical blows, yet instead of shame or hurt, a strange calm washed over me. A peaceful, almost pleasant calm. I smiled, a small, satisfied curve of my lips that seemed to confuse Esm far more than tears or anger would have. With steady hands, I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. Catching the eye of Marcus, our usual waiter, I gave him a subtle nod. What are you doing? Esme demanded, noticing my composure beginning to crack her confidence. I said nothing. Marcus walked to the small control panel by the bar, where the ambient music was managed. The soft jazz that had filled the room faded, replaced by the unmistakable sound of a video beginning. The large screen flickered to life, not showing the club's usual event calendar, but something far more revealing. Esmond turned toward the screen, and I watched the color drain from her face like water running down a drain. No, she whispered. But there she was, crystal clear in high definition, sitting in what was unmistakably a lawyer's office. The timestamp reads 6 months ago. So, you want to completely sever all ties? The lawyer's voice echoed through the restaurant's sound system. Completely, Esme replied coldly on screen. I don't want her to have any legal claim to contact or visitation. As far as I'm concerned, I never had a daughter. The blood drained from Esme's face, so fast I thought she might collapse on the spot. She stumbled backward, clutching the edge of the table. What is this? David whispered. The video continued. And you understand this means you have no support system, no family connection at all? The lawyer asked. Good, Esme's recorded voice replied. Maybe that will finally teach her that actions have consequences. At that moment, Esme's knees buckled. She collapsed into her chair with such force it slid backward, and then she folded forward onto the table unconscious. The room erupted with gasps and whispers. But I stayed perfectly still, eyes fixed on the screen, watching my daughter-in-law's darkest secret broadcast for everyone who mattered in her carefully constructed social world. I had waited for this moment for exactly 4 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days. It all began one afternoon 4 months earlier. I was arranging flowers in my kitchen when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. At my age, unexpected visitors usually meant a salesperson or a neighbor with gossip I didn't want. But Raymond Torres was nothing like the man I pictured a private investigator to be. In his 50s, wearing a worn grey suit and carrying a battered leather briefcase. His handshake was firm but gentle. His eyes held the exhaustion of someone who had seen the worst of human nature. Mrs. Caldwell, he said carefully, I believe you're expecting me. I had hired him 3 weeks earlier after a conversation with my neighbor. Dorothy planted a seed of suspicion I couldn't shake. Dorothy had seen Esme at a family law office downtown, even though Esme had never mentioned any legal matters. Dorothy's cousin worked as a receptionist there, she said. Family law practice. Please come in. I led Raymond to my kitchen table, the same one where I had made the call to hire him. My hands trembled as I dialed the number. Raymond set his briefcase on the table, opened it expertly, and said, Mrs. Caldwell, what I found was more extensive than you asked me to investigate. My stomach tightened. I had only asked him to look into why Esme was visiting a lawyer. I wasn't prepared for what came next. Before I show you anything, he continued, pulling out a thick manila folder, I need you to understand that. Once you see this, you can't unsee it. Sometimes, ignorance really is bliss. I looked at the folder, then back at his worn face. Mr. Torres, I said steadily, I've been married twice, buried one husband, and raised 3 children on my own. I've learned the truth. No matter how ugly is always better than a beautiful lie. He nodded and opened the folder. The first document I saw was a legal petition dated 18 months earlier. My vision blurred for a moment as I read the header. Petition for termination of parental rights. Voluntary surrender. She has another daughter, Raymond said quietly. Madison. Phillips. She's 23 now. My hand started shaking before I'd finished reading the first paragraph. Esma had voluntarily terminated her parental rights to a daughter from a previous relationship, not because she was young and unprepared, not because of financial hardship. The petition clearly stated she was terminating her rights because she was moving forward with a new family unit and wished to avoid complications. There's more, Raymond said, and I wasn't sure I could handle more. The next document was a report from a social worker. Madison had been 15 when Esma abandoned her, left in the care of an elderly grandmother who died just 2 years later. The girl had aged out of the foster system with no family support, no college fund, no safety net of any kind. Where is she now? My voice came out as barely a whisper. Working 2 jobs in downtown Portland, trying to finish community college. She's been completely on her own since she was 17. I stared at the photo Raymond handed me. Madison had Elliot's eyes, the same warm, brown that came from my son David's side of the family. She had Esme's delicate bone structure, but there was something in her expression that was entirely her own. A weariness, a strength that spoke of someone who'd learned too young that the world could be a cold and unforgiving place. She doesn't know about your family, Raymond continued. As far as Madison is concerned, her mother disappeared from her life and never looked back. She has no idea that Esm remarried and had the life that Madison Eva got to have. The room felt like it was spinning. I gripped the edge of the table trying to process what I was learning. How did you find all this? Public records mostly. Court documents are accessible if you know where to look. I also spoke to some people who knew them before Esmane left Portland. He paused, seeming to weigh his words. Mrs. Caldwell, there's something else you need to know about why she left. I wasn't sure I could take another revelation, but I nodded for him to continue. Madison was getting too old, too independent, starting to ask questions about her father, wanting to know more about her mother's past. According to her former neighbors, Esma had always seemed to view Madison not as a daughter, but as a liability and inconvenient shadow. She wanted to erase from her carefully crafted new life. The words struck me like a punch to the chest. I thought of Elliot, my proud grandson, the son she lavished love on so publicly. Was all that affection just a well-rehearsed act? Was Esmond truly capable of loving any child? Or was Elliot simply still useful, a bright, successful image to protect? There's video, Raymond said quietly, breaking my thoughts. Video? I was able to obtain footage from the law office's security cameras, he explained. Your daughter-in-law was very explicit about her intentions and her feelings toward Madison during her meeting with the attorney. He handed me a small USB drive, the key to a secret I wasn't prepared for. That night, alone in my living room with the curtains drawn tight and the door locked, I watched the footage. Esma sat in the sterile lawyer's office, her face expressionless, speaking of her daughter with such chilling detachment that I felt physically ill. She spoke as if Madison were an old piece of furniture to be discarded, something unwanted, and best forgotten. But it was more than abandonment that horrified me. It was the cold, calculated planning behind it. Esma had clearly researched the legal process thoroughly. She had ensured that Madison would have no way to contact her in the future, no thread linking her past to this new life with David and Elliot. She had erased Madison from her world with the same casual efficiency as deleting files from a computer. That night, sleep eluded me. My mind replayed the image of Madison, working 2 jobs, struggling to put herself through school with No family support. I thought about Elliot, showered in public affection, and wondered what might happen if he ever became inconvenient to Esme's carefully curated image. But mostly, I thought about my son David, how blind he was to the woman he had married. A woman capable of discarding her own child as though she were nothing. I knew I had to act. But how? How do you tell your son that his wife isn't who she pretends to be? How do you explain that the woman he loves abandoned her own daughter like trash? And most importantly, how do you ensure it never happens again? That's when I began planning. I hired Raymond to find Madison, to discover everything he could about her life now. He uncovered a young woman struggling but fiercely determined, working the night shift as a security guard and pulling weekend shifts as a barista just to pay for her classes. She lived in a tiny studio apartment that devoured most of her income, but she made it work by sheer willpower. Meanwhile, Raymond continued to monitor Esme's activities. I needed to know if there were other secrets, other victims of her ruthless manipulation. What he uncovered chilled me to the bone. Esme hadn't just abandoned Madison. She had carefully cut herself off from anyone who knew her past. Former friends, distant relatives, even her own mother were systematically erased from her life without explanation once they ceased to serve her image. My daughter-in-law was not merely selfish or cold. She was a predator specializing in emotional manipulation, and my family was her current hunting ground. Weeks passed in agonizing indecision. Should I tell David immediately? Contact Madison? Confront Esme? Then I recalled something my first husband used to say: the best way to catch a liar is to let them keep talking. So I waited, I watched, I documented, and I prepared for the day Esme's true nature would be revealed to everyone who mattered. Didn't have to wait long. The video continued to play as Esme lay unconscious, her head resting on the white tablecloth as if she had simply decided to nap through her own unraveling. The restaurant staff hurried to clear nearby tables, but not before half the country club witnessed the secret Esme had guarded so fiercely. On the screen, Esme's voice echoed again, cold and merciless. I don't want her to ever find me. As far as the world is concerned, Madison Phillips is not my daughter. David sat frozen, eyes wide as if watching a foreign film without subtitles. His face shifted through confusion, shock, and something bordering on horror. Dad? Elliot's voice was small and uncertain. Who is Madison Phillips? Before David could answer, Esme's eyes fluttered open. She lifted her head slowly, mascara smudged beneath tired eyes, glancing around the dining room as if lost. Then her gaze locked on the television screen, and the crushing reality crashed over her like a physical blow. Turn it off, she whispered. It off? She shouted, struggling to her feet and swaying, lunging toward the controls. But Marcus, our waiter, stepped smoothly between her and the screen. He looked to me, and I gave a slight shake of my head. Please, I said softly. Esme turned to face our table. Her once perfect hair was disheveled, and her designer dress was wrinkled from the fall. This is out of context. You don't understand, she pleaded. Then explain it to us, I said calmly, voice steady, the voice of someone who had spent months preparing for this moment. Who is Madison Phillips, Esme? The question hung heavily in the air, thick as smoke curling through the room. I could feel dozens of conversations freeze mid-sentence, the electric tension of social drama that would be dissected for months. Esme's voice cracked. She glanced desperately at David, searching for any sign he was still on her side. She's my daughter from before I met your father. Your daughter? David's voice was flat, stripped of emotion. You have a daughter? Had, Esme corrected quickly. I had a daughter, It was a long time ago before you and I were together. It was complicated, David. You don't understand what my life was like then. On screen, the lawyer's voice asked, "Are you certain you want to include the clause preventing any future contact?" "This is quite permanent, Miss Phillips." "Completely certain," Esme's recorded voice replied. "I want a clean slate. No complications from my past." Elliot pushed his chair back from the table. "How old was she when you did this?" Esme's eyes darted between her son and her husband. "She was 15. But you have to understand 15. The word exploded from David like a punch to the gut. "You abandoned a 15-year-old. "I didn't abandon her." Esme's voice rose defensively. "She had her grandmother. She had a support system. I just ... I couldn't handle being a mother at that point." I watched this exchange with detached fascination, like someone observing a carefully crafted experiment. For months, I had wondered how Esme would explain herself when confronted. I hadn't expected such a clumsy defense. "But you could handle being a mother to me," Elliot said quietly, a new edge to his voice. "What made me different?" The question caught Esme off guard. She opened and closed her mouth several times before managing. "That's different. You're different." "How?" Elliot pressed. "You just are." Her voice rose, more frantic. "Elliot, you have to understand. I was young when I had Madison. I wasn't ready. But when I met your father, when we had you, I was in a completely different place. I decided it was time to speak up. Actually, Esme, according to court documents, you were 28 when you signed away your rights to Madison. Hardly a child yourself." The silence that followed was so complete. I could hear the clattering of dishes in the kitchen behind us. David finally turned to me for the first time since the video began. "You knew about this?" "I found out 4 months ago." I met his gaze steadily. "I hired a private investigator after I saw Esme coming out of a law office downtown. I wanted to know what she was hiding." "You had me investigated?" Esme's voice pitched higher. "You violated my privacy. You had no right." "I had every right." My voice cut through her protests like a knife. "You married my son. You became part of my family, and something about you never felt right." The video was reaching its conclusion, but the lawyer's final question lingered like a verdict. "And what should we do if Madison Phillips ever tries to contact you in the future?" Esme's voice was chilling in its finality. "Tell her I'm dead." The gasp from nearby tables was audible. Even the restaurant staff paused, staring. Elliot's face had drained of all color. "You wanted her to think you were dead." "It was kinda that way," Esme said desperately. "Don't you see? It was better for her to have a clean break. Tobe able to move on without wondering why I left. This way, she could grieve and heal instead of spending her life hoping he'd come back." "That's the most selfish thing I've ever heard," David said quietly. "Selfish?" Esme whirled on him. "I was trying to protect her. I was trying to do what was best for everyone. No," I said, my voice cutting through her hysteria with quiet authority. "You were trying to protect yourself. You wanted to start fresh with David and Elliot. And Madison was an inconvenience." "That's not true." "Then where is she now, Esme?" I pulled out my phone and showed her the screen where I'd pulled up a recent photo Raymond had taken of Madison leaving her night job. "Where is this daughter you were supposedly protecting?" Esme stared at the photo, and for a moment, something that might have been genuine emotion flickered across her face. Madison looked tired in the picture, wearing a security guard uniform, walking to her car in an empty parking lot at 3 o'clock in the morning. Esme's voice faltered. "She's working 2 jobs to put herself through community college," I continued. "She lives in a studio apartment that costs 3/4 of her income. She has no family, no support system. No safety net of any kind because her mother decided she was an inconvenience. The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. On the screen, the video had finally ended, replaced by Thick Country Club's usual events calendar, as if nothing had happened. David stood up slowly, his movements careful and deliberate, like someone who wasn't sure his legs would support him. I need toll leave. David, wait. Esme reached for his arm, but he stepped away from her touch. Don't, he said quietly. Just don't. Hetton to Elliot. Sam, are you coming with me? Elliot looked between his parents, confusion and hurt warring across his young face. Finally, he nodded and stood up. This isn't over, Esme said, her voice taking on a hard edge as she watched her family preparing to leave her sitting alone. You think you've won something here, Thelma? Yeah, I think destroying my marriage makes you the hero. I gathered my purse and stood to follow my son and grandson. Before I left, I turned back to face her one last time. I didn't destroy your marriage, Esme. I just made sure your husband knew who he was really married to. As we walked through the dining room toward the exit, I could feel dozens of eyes following our progress. Tomorrow, this story would spread through every social circle that mattered to Esme. Her carefully constructed image as the perfect wife and mother would be replaced by the truth about who she really was. But as satisfying as that thought was, I knew this was just the beginning. Esme wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully, and she still had weapons she hadn't used yet. The real battle was just starting. The first jet in Esme's counterattack came exactly 48 hours after the restaurant incident, delivered in the form of a heartbroken phone call from my youngest daughter, Sarah, who lived 3 states away. Mum, what's going on? Sarah's voice was tight with concern. Esme called me this morning crying. She said, "You've been trying to destroy her marriage for months." I was in my garden deadheading roses in the early morning quiet when my phone rang. The peace of morning shattered with my daughter's words, and I sat down heavily on my garden bench, she said. What? She told me you hired someone to spy on her, that you ambushed her at Elliot's graduation dinner with some kind of stop. Mom, she was sobbing. She said you're trying to turn the whole family against her because you've never accepted her. The careful way Sarah spoke told me everything I needed to know. Esme had got into her first, had painted herself as the victim and me as the villain. I could practically heart script my daughter-in-law had used, probably the same one she was. Spreading to anyone who would listen. Sarah, there's more to this story than what Esme told you. I know you two have never gotten along perfectly, but Mum, she said you violated her privacy. She said you had her followed. There was a pause, and when Sarah spoke again, her voice was smaller. Did you really do that? I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of having to defend actions that shouldn't need defending. Yes, I did, but not for the reasons she told you. Then why? How do you explain to your daughter that her brother's wife is a predator? How do you tell her that the woman who's been part of family gatherings for 15 years casually abandoned her own child? She has another daughter, Sarah. A daughter she abandoned when the girl was 15 years old. Silence on the other end of the line. Then quietly, what? Her name is Madison. She's 23 now, working 2 jobs to put herself through community college with no family support. Because Esme legally severed all ties with her, she made sure Madison could never contact her again. Another long pause. Are you sure? I have her court documents, video recordings, everything. But even as I said it, I could hear the doubt creeping into Sarah's voice. Mum, that seems extreme, even for someone you don't like. Are you sure you're not misunderstanding something? Then there it was. The seed Esme had planted was already taking root. My own daughter was questioning my judgment, my motives, my version of events. This was how Esme operated. I'd learned that much from Raymond's investigation. She didn't just abandon people. She systematically destroyed their credibility first, making sure that when the truth came out, it would be dismissed as the vindictive lies of someone with an agenda. After I hung up with Sarah, I sat in my garden for a long time, watching me. Sun climb higher in the sky and thinking about warfare. Most people think battles are won with dramatic gestures, big moments of triumph. But Esme understood something more sophisticated. She knew that the most effective way to win a war was to make your enemy defeat themselves. By the time my neighbor Dorothy came by for our usual afternoon tea, I'd received similar calls from 2 cousins, David's sister Michelle, and even Elliot's girlfriend Jennifer. All of them had heard some version of the same story. Poor Esme, victimized by a bitter mother-in-law who couldn't accept that her son had found happiness. I don't want to take sides, Dorothy said carefully as she settled into my kitchen chair, with her cup of Earl Grey. But people are talking, Thelma, and some of what they're saying. Well, it doesn't make you look very good. What exactly are they saying? Dorothy shifted uncomfortably. That you've been jealous of Esme from the beginning. That you resented how happy she made David. How perfect their family seemed. They're saying, you hired that investigator to dig up dirt on her. And when you couldn't find anything really damaging, you took things out of context to make her look bad. Out of context. I couldn't keep the edge out of me voice. Dorothy, she abandoned her 15-year-old daughter. She legally arrested her own child. How is that out of context? Well, Dorothy said slowly. According to what I heard, the girl was troubled. Acting out? Getting into drugs? Maybe. And Esme was young and scared, and thought the girl would be better. Off with other family members who could handle her better. I stared at Mule's friend, watching her repeat Esme's lies with the conviction of someone who wanted to believe them. Where did you hear that version? Esme called me yesterday. She was so upset, Thelma. She said she'd been planning to tell David about Madison when the time was right. But you forced her hand by making it public. She said the whole situation was more complicated than it looked. Of course, Esme had called Dorothy. She was working her way through my entire support system, rewriting history conversation by conversation. Did she mention that Madison has been completely on her own since she was 17? That she aged out of foster care with no family support? Dorothy frowned. She said the girl chose to cut contact with the family, that Madison was angry about the custody arrangement, and refused to maintain relationships. Lies wrapped in just enough plausible detail to sound credible. Esme had clearly spent the last 2 days crafting a narrative that transformed her from predator to victim, from abandoner to abandoned. The really masterful part was how she positioned my investigation as the real betrayal. By focusing on my violation of privacy rather than what that investigation had uncovered, she'd made me the villain in my own story. That evening, David called, "Mum, we need to talk." His voice was careful, controlled in a way that made my stomach clench. This wasn't the voice of a son calling his mother. This was the voice of someone who'd been convinced he needed to manage a difficult situation. "Of course, sweetheart. Do you want to come over for dinner? Actually, I think it would be better if we met somewhere neutral. How about that coffee shop on Elm Street tomorrow at 2? Neutral, as if I was some kind of threat that needed to be contained in a public space. The next afternoon, I arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early and chose a table in the back corner where we could talk privately. David walked in exactly at 2, and the way he moved, purposeful, resigned, told me this wasn't going to be the conversation I'd hoped for. He sat down across from me without ordering anything. his hands folded on the table like he was preparing to deliver bad news. Mum, I've been doing a lot of thinking since graduation night. I imagine you have. The thing is what you did having Esme investigated ambushing her in public like that. It wasn't right. No matter what you found out, that wasn't the way to handle it. I felt something cold settle in my chest. And what would have been the right way? David, you should have come to Met privately. We could have talked about it as a family. Worked through whatever issues you had with my wife. Issues I had. I repeated carefully. David, this isn't about me not liking Esm. This is about her abandoning her own child. According to Esm, the situation with Madison was more complicated than what you saw in that video. She said she was trying to do what was best for a troubled teenager and that you deliberately took her words out of context to make her look as bad as possible. There it was, the rewritten history delivered by my own son, the earnest conviction of someone who desperately wanted to believe it. Did she also tell you that Madison has been working 2 jobs to survive? That she has no family support system at all? David's jaw tightened. She told me that Madison chose to cut off contact with the family, that she was angry about the custody situation and refused to accept help. And you believe that? I believe my wife, he said firmly. And frankly, Mum, the fact that you went to such lengths to dig up her past makes me question your motives. I stared at my son, seeing Esme's handiwork written across his face like graffiti. She'd taken his natural loyalty and twisted it into a weapon against me. My motives? I kept my voice level, but inside I was screaming. David, I was trying to protect this family. From what? From a woman who made some difficult decisions as a young mother. From someone who was trying to start fresh and build a better life. From someone who is capable of abandoning her own child when that child becomes inconvenient. You don't know. That's what happened. I know exactly what happened. I have the documentation. Documentation that you obtained by violating her privacy and trust. David leaned forward, his voice taking on anage I'd rarely heard directed at me. Mum, I need you to understand something. Esme is my wife. She's the mother of my son, and what you did to her was cruel and vindictive. The words hit me like physical blows. My own son, the child he'd raised and sacrificed for, was defending the woman who'd erased her own daughter from existence. So, what happens now? I asked quietly. Now we all try to move forward. Esme's agreed to consider family counseling toe work through the issues that led to this situation. But she needs to know that she's safe from future attacks. Attacks? She's afraid of you, Mom. She's afraid of what else you might try to do to hurt her. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Esme afraid of me. The woman who'd systematically destroyed a teenage girl's life was afraid of a 6-7-year-old grandmother who'd simply exposed the truth. And what about Madison? I asked. David's expression softened slightly. If what you say about her situation is true, then maybe we can find a way to help her. But that's something Esme and I need to decide together as a family. As a family. The phrase stung because it made clear exactly where I stood in this new dynamic. I was no longer part of the inner circle. I was now an outsider whose opinion might be consulted, but whose judgment was no longer trusted. As David left that coffee shop, I realized that Esm had won the first round of this war more decisively than I'd imagined possible. She hadn't just served my revelation. She'd used it to isolate me from my own family. But what she didn't understand was that I'd been fighting battles longer than she'd been alive, and I wasn't nearly finished yet. 2 weeks after my devastating coffee shop conversation with David, I was in my kitchen making dinner for one when the doorbell rang. It was nearly 7 o'clock in the evening, and I wasn't expecting anyone. Since the graduation dinner incident, my social calendar had become notably lighter as people in my circle tried to navigate the awkward waters of choosing sides in a family drama they didn't fully understand. When I opened the door, I found myself face to face with a young woman who took my breath away. She had David's eyes and Esme's delicate bone structure, but there was something in her expression that was entirely her own. A quiet strength mixed with nervous determination. "Mrs. Caldwell, my name is Madison Phillips. I think we need to talk." My legs nearly gave out. After months of investigating her life from a distance, seeing her standing on my doorstep felt surreal, like a character from a book had stepped into reality. "Madison," I gripped the doorframe to steady myself. "How did you find me?" "It wasn't easy." She shifted a worn backpack on her shoulder. "But when someone hires a private investigator to look into your life, word eventually gets back to you, especially in a city as small as Portland." Of course, Raymond had been discreet, but not invisible. In my focus on gathering information about Madison, I hadn't considered that she might become aware of the investigation. "Igno, this is strange," she continued. "But I drove down from Portland because I had to understand why someone was asking questions about me and what I learned." She paused, her voice catching slightly. "What I learned changed everything I thought I knew about my life." I stepped aside to let her in, my mind racing. "Please come in. Can I get you something to eat? You must be tired from the drive. Coffee would be great if you have it." As I busied myself with making coffee, Madison stood in my kitchen looking around with curious eyes. She was smaller than I'd expected from Raymond's photos, probably barely 5'3", but there was a presence about her that filled the room. "So, you're Esme's mother-in-law," she said finally. "I am, and you're her daughter." Apparently, the word came out bitter, though I spent the last 8 years believing she was dead. I nearly dropped the coffee pot. "What?" Madison sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where Raymond had first shown me the documents that exposed Desma's lies. When I aged out of foster care, I tried to find her. I hired a chief investigator with money I'd saved from my first job. He came back and told me my mother had died in a car accident 2 years earlier. The coffee maker gurgled in the silence that followed her words. I felt like I was drowning in the anonymity of what she was telling me. He showed me a death certificate and everything. Madison continued, said he tracked down her last known address and found records of her death. I grieved for her, Mrs. Caldwell. I spent 3 years going to therapy to work through my feelings about losing a mother I'd barely known. That she wasn't dead. No. She was here playing happy family with your son and grandson while I was working night shifts to pay 4 community college classes. Madison's voice was steady, but I could see her hands trembling slightly around her coffee cup. "Do you know what it's like to find out that your mother not only abandoned you, but paid someone to Macao, believe she was dead?" The room spun slightly as the full scope of Esme's cruelty hit me. It wasn't enough for her to abandon Madison. She'd had to make sure the girl could never find her, never disrupt her new life. "How did you find out the truth?" "Your investigator was good, but not perfect. When he started asking questions in Portland, it got back to the woman who used to clean my grandmother's house. She remembered me, remembered my situation. She also remembered that my mother had paid her to spread the story about the car accident if anyone ever came looking." I sat down heavily across from Madison, feeling physically sick. She paid someone to fake her own death. A fair-handed to make sure her past stayed buried. Madison's laugh was hollow. "Cheaper than child support, I guess." "Madison, I'm so sorry. I had no idea she'd gone that far." "It's not your fault." Madison studied my face carefully. "But I need to understand why you were investigating me. What does my mother's abandoned daughter have to do with your family?" So, I told her everything about the private investigator, about the video, about the confrontation at the restaurant. I told her about David's refusal to believe the truth, about how Esme had managed to paint herself as the victim in her own story. When I finished, Madison sat quietly for a long time, processing what I'd shared. She has a son, she said finally. My half-brother Elliot, he's 22. Just graduated from Harvard Law School. And he doesn't know about me. He does now. He was there when the video played. Madison nodded slowly. What did he say? He was shocked, confused. But Esme has been working very hard to control the narrative since then. She's convinced most of the family that this situation was more complicated than it appeared. Complicated how? I hesitated, not wanting to repeat Esme's lies. But Madison needed to know what she was up against. She's telling people you were troubled, that you had substance abuse issues and were acting out. She's saying she made the difficult decision to let you be raised by family members who could better handle your problems. Madison's coffee cup hit the table with the now forced to slush liquid over the rim. Substance abuse, acting out. Her voice rose with indignation. Mrs. Caldwell, I was 15 years old and my mother disappeared from my life without explanation. My grandmother was 78 and had arthritis so bad she could barely take care of herself. I was getting A's in school and working a part-time job to help pay for groceries. I know. I've seen your school records. Then you know she's lying, I do. But, unfortunately, my family seems more inclined to believe her version. Madison stood up and walked to my kitchen window, staring out at the garden where I'd been working when Sarah called to tell me about Esme's damage control campaign. I want to meet them, she said finally. Who? My half-brother. Your son. I want them to hear the truth from me directly. My stomach clenched with worry. Madison, I don't think that's a good idea. Esme has had weeks to prepare them for something like this. She have an explanation ready. Then I guess we'll see how convincing her explanations are when I'm standing right there to contradict them. There was something in Madison's voice that reminded me of myself at her age. A quiet determination that wouldn't be swayed by other people's comfort or convenience. What do you want from this? I asked gently. What are you hoping to accomplish? Madison turned back to face me, and I saw tears gathering in her eyes for the first time since she'd arrived. I want my half-brother to know that I exist. I want him to know that our mother is capable of erasing her own children when they become inconvenient, and I want to make sure it never happens to him. The weight of her words settled over the kitchen like dust after an explosion. Madison wasn't here for revenge or money, or even necessarily for reconciliation. She was here to protect a brother she'd never met from a mother who'd already proven she was capable of the unthinkable. There's a family barbecue this Saturday, I said slowly, at David and Esme's house. It's supposed to be a healing gathering to bring everyone together after the restaurant incident. Will you take me? I thought about David's anger, about Esme's carefully constructed victim narrative, about the way my own family had turned against me in the space of a few weeks. Yes, I said, I'll take you. Because sometimes the only way to fight a lie is to drag the truth into the same room and let them battle it out face to face. The next Saturday arrived grey and drizzly, the kind of Pacific Northwest weather that makes everything feel heavy and uncertain. Madison had driven down from Portland, Oregon, this time with a small suitcase, prepared to stay through the weekend, if necessary. We sat in my car outside David's house for several minutes, watching through the windows as my family moved around inside, preparing for their healing gathering. Are you ready for this? I asked Madison. She smoothed down her simple blue dress, that kind of outfit someone wears when they want to look respectable, but can't afford anything fancy. No, but I don't think I'll ever be ready, so we might as well get it over with. I knocked on the front door instead of using my key. Asmal acknowledgement that my status in this house had changed. When David opened the door, his face went through a series of expressions. Surprise, confusion, and finally a carefully controlled neutrality. Mum, I wasn't sure you were coming. "I brought someone I'd like you to meet," I said, stepping aside so he could see Madison clearly. David's eyes widened as he took in her familiar features. Even someone determined to disbelieve the truth couldn't miss the family resemblance. "This is Madison Phillips," I said clearly. "Your stepdaughter." For a moment, David just stood there, mouth slightly open, staring at the young woman on his doorstep, who shared his son's eyes and his wife's bone structure. "Hello," Madison said simply. "I've been looking forward to meeting you." From somewhere behind David, I heard a glass shatter against the kitchen floor, followed by Esme's voice calling out in false cheerfulness. "David, who's at the door?" "I think," Madison said quietly, "it's time for Ariel family reunion." The moment Madison stepped into David's living room, their carefully orchestrated healing gathering transformed into something else entirely. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as relatives who'd been debating my version of events for weeks found themselves face-to-face with living proof of Esme's deception. Esme stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, a dish towel still in her hands from cleaning up whatever she'd dropped when she heard Madison's name. Her face had gone completely white, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely scared. "Madison." Elliot's voice came from the couch where he'd been sitting with his girlfriend, Jennifer. He stood up slowly, studying the young woman beside me with obvious fascination. You're my sister?" "Half-sister," Madison corrected gently. But yes, the resemblance between them wasn't mistaken now that they were in the same room. Both had inherited David's warm brown eyes and expressive eyebrows, though Madison's were more defined from years of careful grooming on a tight budget. "I don't understand," David said, his voice strained. "Madison, if you're really Esme's daughter, why didn't you contact us before now?" Madison's laugh was soft but bitter. "Because until 2 weeks ago, I thought my mother was dead." The silence that followed was so complete. I could hear the coffee maker gurgling in the kitchen. Around the room, family members who had spent weeks quietly choosing sides now found themselves forced to recalibrate everything they thought they knew. The air was thick with disbelief and shifting loyalties. Esme's voice finally broke the heavy silence, high and thin, trembling on the edge of desperation. "That's not possible. Madison, sweetheart. You know that's not true. You were angry when I remarried, and you chose to cut contact with me." But Madison's voice rang out, firm and steady, growing stronger with each word. "I was 15 years old when you signed papers terminating your parental rights. I was 17 when I aged out of foster care with no family support. And I was 20 when I hired an investigator to find you, only to be told you died in a car accident." She reached into her backpack and pulled out a worn folder, handing it over to David. "These are copies of all the documents. The court papers you signed, the fake death certificate someone provided to the investigator I hired, even receipts, showing payments made to ensure that story would hold up if anyone came looking." David's hand shook as he opened the folder, his eyes scanning the evidence of his wife's systematic deception. "You paid someone to fake your own death?" His voice was barely more than a whisper, heavy with disbelief. "David, you have to understand," Esme said, stepping toward him with pleading hands. The situation was complicated. Madison was going through a difficult phase. I was getting straight A's. Madison cut through the excuse like a blade. I was working a part-time job to help my elderly grandmother pay for groceries. The only thing I was going through was trying to understand why my mother disappeared from my life without explanation. She turned to face the entire room, her voice growing with quiet confidence. "I want everyone here to understand something. I didn't come for money or revenge or to break up anyone's family. I came here because I discovered that my mother, who I grieved for 3 years believing she was dead, has been living a completely different life while I struggled to survive on my own. Elliot stepped forward, his young face serious with the weight of understanding. What has your life been like since she left? Madison met his gaze steadily. I've worked 2 jobs for the past 5 years to put myself through community college. I live in a studio apartment that consumes most of my income. I've had no family support, no safety net, no one to call when things got difficult. Her voice softened, a flicker of vulnerability crossing her features. But I've also learned that I'm stronger than I ever thought possible. Oh, sweetheart, Michelle, my sister-in-law, said from across the room, her voice full of genuine sympathy. We had no idea, Madison replied, because I was never meant to know. My mother made sure of that. Esme was slowly backing toward the kitchen, her carefully constructed world collapsing like a house of cards. You don't understand, she kept repeating, desperation creeping into her voice. None of you understand how complicated the situation was. Then explain it to us. David's voice was hard now, leaving no room for evasion. Explain how abandoning a 15-year-old and faking your own death was the right thing to do. She wasn't my responsibility anymore. Esme's facade finally shattered, revealing the cold, calculating woman beneath. I had a new life, a new family. I couldn't have my past following me around, complicating things. The blunt honesty of her words hit the room like a physical blow. Several people instinctively stepped back, as if Esme's callousness were contagious. You just erased her, Elliot said quietly, disbelief heavy in his voice. You erased your own daughter. I did what I had to do. Esme's voice rose, nearing a shriek. You think it was easy? You think I wanted to give up my child? But I had to choose between my past and my future, and I chose my future. You chose yourself, Madison said, devastating in her simplicity. You chose your own comfort over your child's well-being. David set the folder down on the coffee table, his gaze locked on his wife with an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't anger or disappointment. It was a clear, hard recognition of who she truly was. Get out, he said quietly. David, please get out of my house. Get out of my life. Get away from my family. Esme spat back venomously. Your family? His voice turned grim with satisfaction. Half of everything in this house is mine, half of your assets. Half of your retirement. You can't just throw me out. Actually, David said, steady and cold. I can. The prenup you insisted on works both ways, Esme. If either spouse commits fraud or materially misrepresents their character, the marriage can be dissolved with no financial obligations. Her face went pale. You wouldn't. Abandoning your child and faking your own death to hide it from your new family seems like material misrepresentation to me, David continued. My lawyer will be in touch about the divorce proceedings. Esme's eyes darted around the room, searching for even one sympathetic face. She found none. Even those relatives who'd once given her the benefit of the doubt now looked upon her with undisguised revulsion. You'll regret this, she hissed at last, voice low and dangerous. All of you have no idea what you're throwing away. A liar and a child abandoner, Madison responded calmly. I think we'll manage. After Esme stormed out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows, the family spent the rest of the evening getting to know Madison. She spoke about her life in Portland, her work as a night security guard, and her dreams of becoming a social worker. She showed pictures of the small apartment she was proud to call her own, the first place that had ever truly belonged to her. But what struck me most was how naturally she fit into our family. She shared David's dry sense of humor and practical approach to problems. She had Elliot's love of books and his quiet intensity when discussing things that mattered. Watching my grandson and his half-sister discover their bond was like seeing two puzzle pieces finally click together. I can't believe I have a sister, Elliot said at one point, shaking his head in wonder. Half-sister, Madison corrected with a smile. Sister, he insisted. The half part is just biology. Sisters are about choice. 6 months later, I stood in my kitchen, making Sunday dinner for a larger crowd than I had in years. Madison had transferred to a school closer to us, and David was helping her with tuition. Elliot had convinced her to move into the guest room at his apartment, claiming he needed a study partner for the bar exam. The divorce finalized quickly once David's lawyer presented the evidence of Esme's deception. She had disappeared from our lives as thoroughly as she once had from Madison's, leaving only the memories of the damage she tried to inflict. But the most satisfying change was in my family. The crisis stripped away all the polite pretenses and careful social maneuvering that had characterized us for years. Now, we were closer, more honest, more willing to have the difficult conversations. Grandma Thelma, Madison appeared in the kitchen doorway, holding a bottle of wine. David had sent her to ask if I needed help. I smiled at the title she'd chosen. For me, not Mrs. Caldwell, not Thelma, but Grandma. A name that acknowledged her place in our family while honoring the relationship she'd built with my son and grandson. Think we're almost ready, I said, checking the roast in the oven. How are you settling in at school? Better than I expected. She leaned against the counter, relaxed in a way I'd never seen in those first tense meetings. It's strange having people who care whether I succeed or fail. And still, getting used to it. Good strange or bad strange? Definitely good. She paused, then added quietly, Thank you for investigating, for confronting her, for bringing me into this family. I know it wasn't easy. I studied her face, seeing not just the young woman she'd become, but glimpses of the frightened 15-year-old who had been abandoned, the determined 17-year-old who aged out of foster care, the hopeful 20-year-old who grieved for a mother who was never really dead. You did the hard part, I told her gently. You survived. You built a life for yourself with no help from anyone. All I did was make sure the truth came to light. All you did, Madison repeated with a soft smile, was save me from spending the rest of my life believing I wasn't worth loving. From the dining room, I heard David and Elliot debating with the passionate intensity that runs in our family. Their voices, joined by Madison's laughter, filled my house with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. Esme tried to erase Madison to protect her perfect life from the inconvenient past she'd created. But in the end, her cruelty only brought our family closer together. Madison wasn't a liability to hide. She was the missing piece we never knew we needed. As we sat down to dinner that Sunday, I looked around the table at my son, my grandson, and the granddaughter I'd gained through tragedy and truth. This wasn't the family Esme tried to build through lies and manipulation. This was better. This was real. Now, I'm curious about you, who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. Meanwhile, on the final screen, I'm leaving 2 other channel favorites that will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until the end.